Zichronot is not really in these verses about God remembering our deeds and meting out punishment or reward, but more God remembering us and connecting us, a remembering that leads to an action of redemption and saving. So that again plays out in the verse that we're on. Okay, so we're in Psalm 106 for this, the last of the Zichronot verses from Ketuvim, from Psalms. And Psalm 106 is one of these Psalms that runs through the entire history of the Jewish people, which you could sum up as, God did things for you. You said you were going to love God, but you rebelled, but then God forgave you. And I think that sort of gets repeated over and over again in the telling of the story of the Jewish people and its relationship with God, at least in this psalm. And this is towards the end of the psalm, where after all of the trials of history, long after the redemption from Egypt, when Israel is back in trouble again, we see, and they're in trouble because they have rebelled. We pick up with verse 44. Vayar batzar lahem b'shamot rinatam. God saw them in their troubles, heard their cry, or Robert Alter translates song of prayer. Rina can have positive or negative aspects to it, but here it seems negative. They cried out to God. Vayizkor lahem brito. God recalled for them the covenant. Vayinachem karov chasadav, and the recalling leads to the nechama, to the relenting. And vayitenotam l'rachamim, and God granted them mercy lifnei kol shoveim, in the eyes of all their captors. Here, the captors are not the Pharaoh of Egypt, but perhaps something concurrent with this psalm, some exile experience that the Jewish people are in. So God sees, God hears, God remembers, and God acts by forgiving. That's sort of the way in which we're seeing this play out over and over again in the Torah and in the Tanakh. And that's where what we're praying for really in Zichronot is for God to remember and follow that up with an action. This is some of the commentators on this psalm connected to the pasuk that we saw earlier in Torah, which was the beginning of the redemption in Egypt itself. After the king of Egypt dies, not clear exactly what that is, but whatever. After the first round of slavery gets even worse with the second bad pharaoh. What happens? They groan and they cry out. That's similar to the Rina in our verse. So they cry out to God. God hears. God remembers the covenant. Avram, Yitzhak, and Yaakov. We talked about that a few days ago. And then God sees and God knows. And here the knowing is perhaps parallel to the vayinachem, the regretting or the relenting, or God sort of changing God's mind for our favor, knowing in a sense of knowing enough to forgive you. Okay, so the zichronot, the memory leads to an action. Here you can see the seeing is flipped. In our verse, we have seeing, hearing, remembering, and relenting. And in the original story in Egypt, we have hearing, remembering, seeing, and knowing. But if those are sort of the four elements, no matter what the order is, whenever God remembers, then there's some sort of action that follows that's to our benefit. This comes up, in other places in Shemot as well. God hears and God remembers in Perek Vav. I wanted to look in contrast to the way in which humans actually don't remember. Maybe the classic story of a human forgetting, even though this human was asked to remember, and as a result of the human forgetting, the person is not redeemed. This is in the story of Joseph. In the story of Joseph, if you remember when Joseph is in the jail and favorably interprets the dream of the cupbearer for Pharaoh, after interpreting the dream, Joseph says to him, Ki im zichartani itcha kasher yitav lach, v'asita na imadi chesed, v'hizkartani el paro, v'hotzeitani min habayit hazeh. What is the cupbearer supposed to do? Joseph pleads, remember me and do me this kindness of mentioning me to Pharaoh. But mention and remember are the same word in Hebrew, the same root. And what's going to happen? V'hotzeitani min habayit hazeh. As a result of Pharaoh remembering, or you causing Pharaoh to remember by mentioning me, Pharaoh will take me out of this prison, out of this exile, out of this suffering. Okay? But what happens? V'lo zachar Sarah mashkim et Yosef vayishkachehu. But actually, the cupbearer forgot about Joseph, didn't remember him and forgot him, sort of emphasizing that. That's what it means. To be forgotten is to be left in jail. When we're saying Ya'alev Yavo Zichronenu, it's we're in the suffering state and we want the memory to go up. And humans are bad at this, right? The Sarah Mashkim is not a reliable figure to remember us, and as a result of being forgotten, we are remaining in jail. So that's the opposite of what it means for God to remember. When God remembers, God either relents by Yinachem, or God knows by Yedah, or God takes us out. Some action is about to follow as a result of God remembering. By the way, when the Sarah Mashkim remembers finally, a chapter later, he says, "Et chata'ai ani mazkir hayom." I'm going to mention my sins. But here, the mazkir, again, is really, I think, echoing this idea of he's supposed to remember Joseph. So it's not just I mention my sins, but I remember / mention. My sin is that I should have been remembering, and I'm going to say that here. And in some ways, that's probably one of our core sins that we think about, perhaps on high holidays, is the lack of memory that leads to action, the human understanding of memory, which is we're bad at it, and we forget things, and as a result, people suffer. That's part of our sinning ways in contrast to God. How does this play out in Midrash? So in the Yerushalmi, we see that there were a number of things that led to the redemption of Egypt, the redemption of the children of Israel from Egypt. And they discover them, each of these 5 elements, in one verse. And they run through a number of verses that has each of the elements. 5 things led to the redemption of Egypt. There's actually a whole bunch of midrashim that talk about why Israel was redeemed. This is one tradition, but not the only one. And we see here the 5 elements. Mitoch haketz, it was their time. It was the end of the time that they were meant to suffer. Mitoch tzara, because of the trouble they were in. Mitoch tzvacha, because they cried out. Mitoch zchut avot, because of the merit of the ancestors. We talked about that in the previous verses. And mitoch tshuva, and because of repentance. Now here it seems like Israel is doing repentance, you would think, but we'll see how that plays out as they run this through in our verse. Now in our verse, it shifts a little bit. The Kates drops out, the end of time drops out, and mercy comes in. But let's see, I'm scrolling down to our part towards the end of this selection. The Kacho Omer, in our psalm, Tilim Kuf Vav, when God saw them in their troubles, Bayar Batsar Lahem, that's Tzara, there's the trouble. Bishomoat Rinatam, that's the Tzvacha, the Rina, the crying out, the song, as it were, but the song of suffering, that's the screaming, the crying out. Vayizkor Lahem Brito, that's again our verse from Zichronot. Vayizkor Lahem Brito, God remembers the covenant that God had with Zchut Avot, with the ancestors. Vayinachem Kerav Chasadav, Mitoch Tshuva. Here, God relents, and that's the tshuva. That's the tshuva element. Perhaps this is God doing tshuva, God doing some sort of nechama, some I regret, I relent, I'm changing the course that I had set out for the people. If things are not going the way they needed to go, I can shift that as a result of the moment of redemption. So the tshuva here, perhaps, is God actually doing tshuva, God doing vayinachem, God relenting. Also has echoes of the flood story with Noah, when God also relents, but their regrets of having created people. But here God regrets or relents from the punishment that's lasting for us. God does tshuva, God reverses course because of God's abundant love. Vayitenotam l'rachamim, and there's the mercy element. God gives over our view in mercy to our captors. So the model of the redemption from Egypt is the model that is the future redemption. This is sort of one of the core elements of prayer. you get redeemed from Egypt. That's the sign that you can be redeemed again. And here are the elements that are going to lead to that redemption. And remembering is a big part of that. But it's not just a remembering, it's a remembering that leads to action. In this case, the action is some sort of relenting of the path that we were on, where God was going to punish us. Instead, there's some tshuva that God does in order to bring us home. And the last midrash that I'll just mention here is the ultimate destruction ends in the ultimate redemption. The ultimate destruction is in Lamentations when Jerusalem is destroyed. And Rebbe says that everything that happened in the destruction is going to be reversed in the redemption. Nothing that Jerusalem cried out before the Holy One that was not later appeased with her, that was not later made up with her. And we have our verse here is the opposite of Zachra Yerushalayim Yimei Onya Umerudeha. Remember Jerusalem, the days of your woe and sorrow. That gets reversed as Vayiskor Lahem Brito, Vayinachem Karov Chasadav. That God relents and the abundant love leads to our redemption. So again, for Zichronot, if you space out for all of Zichronot is God remembers in a covenantal way, and the remembering leads to an action of redemption. God relents from the path that we were all on and shifts course, just like we could do tshuva. God does tshuva, as it were, on the overall path of our future.